Hey, this is Jeff Nyquist. This is Friends and Enemies with Jeff Nyquist and Alex Benesch in Germany. He's in Germany, I'm in the United States. And we're here to talk about this week the big picture strategy, espionage, the Cold War that continued after everybody thought the Cold War was over. We want to go into details, and this is something I've written about for more than 30 years. This has been something I hate to repeat myself, but it's necessary to go over this material. And Alex, having the German perspective, can give us, really interesting details about how this worked in the heart of Europe. This is the book that really kind of opened my eyes more than anything. New Lies for Old by Anatoly Golitsyn, KGB defector who defected in 1961, December 1961. And he brought with him, he had worked in a KGB counterintelligence think tank in reorganizing the KGB in the late 1950s. And he saw they were reorganizing the KGB for a long-range deception strategy that he said would eventually entail the liberalization, the false liberalization of communism, and the fooling of the West, the putting the West to sleep, disarming the West first intellectually and in terms of thinking that there's a Cold War. And he also warned about that the Sino-Soviet split was being prepared in the late 50s. And he heard a lecture by the head of the KGB, General Alexander Shelepin, mentioning that China was going to have a fake split with the Soviet Union so that America would come in and support China, build China up, trade with China, industrialize China, and that everyone who facilitated these strategies becomes suspect. We talked about Henry Kissinger last week. So this is the big picture view. And I'd like to also mention in this context, this overall shift. Tim Grosclose wrote a book about 10 years ago, actually 2011, called Left Turn, in which he described how the whole of American politics, the whole public, both political parties have been steadily moving to the left for at least 2 decades, if not longer. And he used politimetrics, political measurements, to actually measure opinion. What he found, for example, was that Fox News is 51, or is exactly in the middle, right? In terms, it is fair and balanced. It's halfway between conservative and halfway between a liberal, where you have the most far right congressmen are like a 4. That was that Minnesota congresswoman, and then the most liberal, Nancy Pelosi, was a perfect 100. That's the most farthest left you can go is Nancy Pelosi, right? And so that he developed that, and he showed that the Republican Congress of the Democratic Congress of 1978 was to the right of the Republican Congress in 1999.
Holy moly.
And of course, this is the work of agents of influence. And I think we're going to get into both agents of influence, espionage, deception, strategy, and how the Eastern Bloc remains still there under the surface. And you can speak to this, Alex. So maybe we can talk about the infiltration of Germany.
Yeah, you'd think NATO won the Cold War. That's what we used to think. But it does not feel like NATO has won the Cold War. And especially in this place, Germany, ever since communism supposedly ended, or let's say the Soviet Union supposedly ended, ever since then, We've been having these communist chancellors here in Germany. So, for example, you had Gerhard Schröder, who's always been very anti-American, is super close to the Russians, and big fan of the pipelines. If you go back to his old days in Hanover and check what he said about America and NATO, you get the picture. So it was this guy. Then we had Angela Merkel for what felt like an eternity, and she grew up in communism. She was from Eastern Germany. She was a very loyal communist for that time period, and then she suddenly appeared in Western politics and magically She rose up the ranks in the Conservative Party, mind you, the Christian Democratic Party, and became chancellor. And nobody could really explain why. And so, yeah, she's been completely and utterly horrible. And this was also the time when anti-communism collapsed. When anti-communism collapsed in Germany, so everybody thought, well, this is over. Why shouldn't we, be more left in this way and that way and 50 other ways? Yeah, that was that period, and then of course we had Olaf Scholz, who is the current chancellor. And when he was a young guy in his 20s, he was invited to Soviet Eastern Germany, to Soviet Eastern Germany multiple times, and he was treated like an important, let's say, diplomat or a foreign minister or something. So he was picked up with the nice car. He was driven to the hotel, the location. And they had these weird workshops or whatever, and he was meeting important people. That happened multiple times. Why? Why would you invite a Western, leftist and treat him that way? And so, yeah, so it never felt like communism was defeated. It never really did. So it almost felt like NATO lost over here. That's what it felt like, and I'm not blaming the Americans for this. I'm just looking for the networks and the mechanisms that caused this to happen. So when Golitsyn, I recently reread Golitsyn's book, and I thought it was too soft. Some people say he goes too far. I say no. This is the softer version of reality. It's worse than he tells you, and so it doesn't feel like the Soviet Union. It doesn't feel like the Soviet Union went bust. So right now, next couple of days, there will be the beginning of a very important court case in Germany. It's supposed to be the worst mole since the Cold War, and it's a guy who worked for the Foreign Intelligence Service of Germany, which is the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND. And so, according to what's been in the press so far, this guy was not just a fan of the Putin regime. He was also getting into this new weird right-wing stuff. This weird new right wing, and he allegedly sold anything he could to the Russians. So it was money and ideological reasons. And so he was not even caught by his own people initially. So the press tells us that a Western intelligence service, probably the Americans, a Western service noticed, by getting information out of Russia, they noticed that there was a mole in Germany giving stuff to the Russians. So when this Western intelligence service, probably the Americans, when they told the BND, you got a mole, that's when they had to go look for who was able to give away all this stuff, and was a small group of suspects, and then finally they got their prime suspect. And so this court case is set to begin in a few days. And what he gave away in terms of intelligence not just affected German security, it affected American security. Because he was from the technical department at the BND, which apparently is the only department that gets anything done and actually collects foreign intelligence. And so he was compromising American operations and methods. So this is a problem for America, not just in conjunction.
Because America, I should explain, America's terrible at human intelligence. What they're good is in technical collection.
Yeah.
That means satellites, that means tapping into computers, that means phone lines. And so this is the main way we get anything. And the Russians, of course, are very well aware of that. If you talk to a Russian defector, he'll say, we never try to say anything over the phone. They know about this. We had submarines go out. send commando teams in, tap into things. We had spies that went into sewer lines
Mm,
where communications lines were, tapped into things. So even in the Kremlin, they were paranoid about saying anything over the phone, and certainly nothing that goes through the air,
yeah.
right, that could be intercepted. This is where their insecurity comes in. So if this guy in Germany was part of that system with the Americans, that would tell them, oh, this is where they're tapping into
Mm,
us. And that's huge.
yeah. So there's been some interesting tidbits in the press. We will hear a lot more about this when the court case actually starts. We won't be getting the full picture because this is all heavily classified, of course. But what we know so far, I think the Americans were able to hack into the encrypted text communications of the infamous Wagner group, I think it was, and some other very important things. So this one guy, this German guy, this one German guy probably ruined a lot of American intelligence work. And this is not the first time this happened. So in the Cold War, the B&D was infiltrated as well. And this also affected American security. So you had moles like Heinz Felfe, you had Gabriele Gast. And I think one of these two compromised or blew the cover of, I think it was 100 American intelligence assets. So
Well,
the
the
damage
Galen
report, yeah.
organization, Felfa had infiltrated the Galen organization in the 50s. And Galen was kind of on a roll. He thought he was doing good. Galen was doing pretty good, but they figured out a way to get this guy in. And of course, Galen's organization, when West Germany was forming, West Germany didn't have an intelligence organization. And of course, it was under occupation before the state was reformed. And so Galen ran a private organization under the Americans. He actually went from Germany after the war with his team to Washington. And people say, oh, this is Operation Paperclip. He was a Nazi. No, he was a Prussian officer who really was on the, Hitler wanted to put him in an insane asylum towards the end of the war. He almost got institutionalized because Hitler was so angry at him. But he was Foreign Armies East under the Third Reich, which meant he was charged with watching the Russians, which military intelligence on the Soviet Union. So he had all these sources that the Americans inherited. Well, the Russians were just very good at flipping people when they would figure out who it was. And so this meant that progressively everything we were getting from Russia was being flipped. And when Felfa got in, it meant that everything that Galen was doing at some point was completely under Russian control.
Yeah, and so imagine we know from recent books about the NSA, British GCHQ, the Snowden fallout, and all that. So there's been some books written by decent authors, not just the terrible ones, and you do get a broader, more up-to-date picture on American signal intelligence gathering. And so the issue was that Germany is sort of a conduit territory. So if the Americans want to get into Russia electronically, the Americans have to go through Germany to some degree, and some other infrastructure. And so the Germans, the B&D service, they were actually quite capable in the technical department. So there was some very encouraging words by the Americans and the Brits about the Germans. So, for example, at some of these choke points, where the data is filtered and scanned for certain things. At these points, the Germans could scan faster than the Americans or the Brits could. So, it's a very German thing, right? They want to prove themselves. They want to make things faster and better and stuff. But if further up the chain there's a mole, that can lead to a disaster for not just German intelligence, but a disaster for American American intelligence.
Yeah, I should mention, and you can correct me, but what I've read in the different accounts is that the Germans, it wasn't, the West likes to brag about Bletchley Park
Mm,
and the code breaking, where they could read the German codes, and of course they did. But what a lot of people don't realize, the Germans broke the Allied codes, and
mm,
even worse, the Germans managed to tap into the transatlantic phone line, and they actually were recording and listening to some of the conversations over the line between Roosevelt and Churchill, whatever good that did them.
oops.
But they did learn some critical things. So the Germans were not without their technical capabilities. Their problem, like many of the Western services, was
Human
when you deal
intelligence.
with the Russians, you're dealing with people who are artists at human intelligence. And I should mention in this spy of yours how in Russian spycraft, in Russian intelligence, how these moles are used. This mole, particularly that you're mentioning, people say, well, what does that matter? Well, how do they use this? They just means what? Well, they have something called the feedback loop. So our intelligence services are gathering information on Russia, and so what they do is they have moles in the CIA and in the analytical department, in the politicians who are sometimes browbeating the intelligence analysts to adulterate their product. Same thing in Germany, same thing in France, same thing in the UK. And at the same time, so what is happening is if the Russians know what we found out,
Yeah.
like let's say we find out something, so the Russians can then go and discredit it.
Mm.
They can credit that information.
Or they can
Call it into
feed,
question.
or they can feed bad intel into their own
Right.
system,
And
so it gets
then,
stolen.
right. Then they use all their double agents that we think are our agents in their country, and they feed them all the same set of information to make the true information look false. And they did this time and time again to the Americans. They seriously confused James Angleton, who was one of our best, although he had a lot of things right. He would admit, look, I got this
Yeah.
wrong, I got that wrong. And of course, it's because, for example, we found out after the Cold War, every single one of the CIA's agents in East Germany were double back on us.
Yeah.
Every one. And every one of our agents in communist Cuba were doubled back on us. Now, what about Russia? Russia's more controversial, but it's probably the case there. And so if they got Cuba, if they got East Germany, they can only really do that if they have moles in the CIA
Yeah.
that are helping them, because otherwise their double agents get found out. But these double agents fed false information to the Americans for years and years, and that information was believed. And
Yeah.
we know that in FBI counterintelligence, we had Robert Hansen, and in the CIA, we had Alder James, and they were working the Russia desks on counterintelligence.
Yeah. And so when, nowadays, in the current political climate in the United States, when, conservatives or whatever, or Tucker Carlson or whoever, when they say, let's abandon Ukraine, why should we care about Ukraine? If Russia takes Ukraine, then Ukraine becomes conservative, whatever. So if people push that notion, then ask yourself what's going to happen next and what's going to happen then, and how is this going to affect America, okay? So I mentioned before, our security, our German security, totally depends on the United States of America. We can't handle intelligence on our own. We do not have a military to speak of. Latest estimate, we would need 15 years prior warning and 15 years of intense preparation to be able to somehow defend ourselves. We're 15 years behind. So if Ukraine falls, then the next country to fall could be Poland, and then it's Germany. And then what happens if the Russians take all these people, and if the Russians actually take Germany's industry and the German people and the German engineers, that will make Russia a much bigger threat to the United States. Because right now their economy is terrible, their economy is terrible, their demographics are terrible, but if they take what they don't have right now, what they need, then it becomes a whole different ballgame for the Americans. So our fate is tied to the American fate and vice versa. It does go in circles, right? And so
Germany added to Russia would quintuple Russia's economic potential.
Yeah, and so sometimes because sometimes Germans, when Germans listen to my stuff, they would ask, why do you care so much about America? And the answer is obvious. And sometimes maybe an American would ask me, why do you care so much about America, or why do you want to meddle in American affairs? Well, we depend on America, one, and the other thing is this. I have 3 cousins in the United States, American-born citizens. So it's not just the safety aspect, the security aspect. It's also a question of our Americans and Germans. There's so much overlap there, and many Americans have German ancestors and German roots. So. This all really matters, and even if you look at Ukraine, Ukraine is a country full of people that are pro-Western. The Ukrainians, they look more like us. They look more like us than they look like the Russians. And the Ukrainians, they want to be like the West. The Ukrainians, they want to have what Americans have, and so it's ridiculous to abandon Ukraine, especially when you use these weird arguments like, well, why should we give money to Ukraine when there's corruption in Ukraine? Same argument, exactly same argument was used to, decades earlier. Same argument was used to abandon the Chinese nationalists. This was the same argument.
And also the same argument to abandon Vietnam and Cambodia in the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
Same
and the biggest,
argument.
and the worst fallout was China, obviously, because we know what happened then. Communists took over, but the argument was, well, the money, we don't know where the money is going, and should we really be involved, and is this really interesting for us? And let's not give weapons anymore to the Chinese nationalists. Let's not give ammo to them, and see what happened. And now we get the same argument. Oh, why should America care about Ukraine? Well, because Poland's next, and Germany's next, and then Russia is a much bigger enemy, and Russia has been aligned with China the whole time. Do Americans really want to face a monolithic enemy that has absorbed Western Europe? Do they really want to deal with that? I think not.
And that is if this is pretty easy to see coming, because if you look at I did the numbers, and maybe I mentioned this before. I did the numbers. The armies of Germany, Baltic states, and Poland, which would be the main armies, the main troops involved in the defense of Poland and the Baltic states, and the American troops in Europe, 100,000 American troops in Europe. If you add them all together, it's smaller than the current Ukrainian army. Yeah. And by the way, less ready, less battle-hardened, completely unable to cope with the kind of, if we don't have enough artillery shells for the Ukrainian army, we're not going to have enough for our own.
Yeah.
This is
and guess what?
An issue.
And guess what? When guess what? When I drove a Ford Explorer, right? I used to drive a Ford Explorer, and I love that car. It's an American design car. But at the time, Ford also officially sold the car in Europe. So you had an American version of it, and you had a German version of it. I love this car, and so I tried to get to know how this car was designed. Was that a
pickup truck?
No, that was the SUV. That was the second generation.
It was an SUV, okay.
That was a second generation Ford Explorer SUV, and it was my favorite car of all times. I've driven I've driven Audis, I've driven Mercedes, but I really like the Ford, right? I really like the Ford, and so I've gotten to know this car, and well, guess what? The engine of that car was made in Germany, was made in Cologne. And not just for the German edition of the Ford Explorer. This was worldwide. So this was the, I think it was the overhead valve V6. No, not the V6, it was straight six. I think it was the overhead valve straight six. They called it the Cologne engine. So they made a lot of these engines in Cologne. I think they shipped it to Kentucky and built, Explorers over there, if I'm not mistaken. And then, quite a few of the parts, so the other parts in this car were made by Bosch. The famous German company Bosch that makes all these fuel systems and engine control systems, that sort of stuff. And so, this was like a German American car. And so imagine what the Russians can do if they take us over. So we've seen this all during the Ukraine invasion, when the Russian equipment that was damaged or captured, when this Russian equipment was taken apart, and experts were looking at every little single bit, and they were checking the serial numbers of the parts. And guess what happened? They found Bosch engine control systems. They found all kinds of Western parts, German parts. And so their army couldn't function without German parts, among other, manufacturer countries.
Their electronic equipment is French on their mechanized units.
Exactly. Yeah. And so so this is what we're talking about. This is why this is so important. And yes, and there's so many aspects to this whole thing right now. I mean, I recently did a report on the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is an old school communist. I mentioned him before. He visited, communist Germany, Eastern Germany, multiple times. Was treated very well over there, and now he's the Chancellor of Germany. And so this guy, in the past, this was more than 20 years ago, almost like 25 years ago, this guy was responsible for the city of Hamburg, right? And so this city is very, very red. It's very much controlled by, left-wing people, communists, social democrats, his party. And so these leftists, they were responsible for the security of Hamburg. And Hamburg just happens to be a hotbed for Islamism. So you get you got Al-Qaeda in Hamburg, you got the Iranians in Hamburg, you get the Salafis in Hamburg, just all these groups. And so while he was responsible and his people were responsible for the security of Hamburg, there was an Al-Qaeda cell in Hamburg. They just called it now the Hamburg cell. And
Mohammed Atta went to school.
Yeah, exactly. So the names should
hijacker for 9/11.
Exactly. So the names should be familiar for Americans. It was Mohammed Atta, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Said Bahaji, Marwan al-Shehi, Siad Jarrah, Zakaria Essaba, and Munir al-Motassadegh. And some of these people managed to then leave Hamburg, leave Germany, go to America, and commit those terrorist attacks. And that's not where the story ends, because as we know, America's intelligence had been severely damaged, within America and outside of America, because of these Russian moles, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen. And so it was harder to track Al-Qaeda, not impossible. And some FBI agents managed to track some of these people, these hijackers. They managed to track them at the flight schools, and then they gave those leads to the appropriate places. But these promising leads were stuffed into a pile of 3,000 other leads, and there were only 2 people assigned for that pile. So there may be more moles who sabotaged these investigations before 9/11. So you have to look at Russian involvement.
How do you get a pile like that, right?
Yeah.
And there's something more about Mohammed Atta, I should say. And I think I mentioned it before, but I had contact with a Czech intelligence officer who was jailed by the Czech government. And there's a funny story about that. He was trying to blow the whistle on contacts with Muslim extremists by elements in Czechia that had been connected to the communist structures that was still going on in the year 2000, in early 2001. And what he had information that Muhammad Atta, after 9/11, that Muhammad Atta had trained in communist Czechoslovakia in a terrorist training camp in 1987.
Oh boy.
And so, and of course, one of a journalist, political scientist here, Edward J. Epstein, if I am remembering correctly, went over there to try to look into it. But my Czech friends told me he went to the wrong people, to the people they believed were agents of Moscow, and got misled. But this is an important angle to the story because we know it's a fact. You can look it up. Muhammad Atta made all these trips to Czechoslovakia. Why? People tried to claim he was meeting one of Saddam Hussein's people there, but no, I think it was the Russians and the communists.
And that's not where the story ends. So after 9/11, you get the war on terror. And the war on terror was used as a pretext over here by the Social Democrats, that very same party. It was used by the Social Democrats to move Germany away from America and move it closer to Russia. Isn't that interesting how this all comes together?
What was the logic for doing that? Because the Americans were awful aggressors invading innocent countries?
Well, it was, you have to remember the biggest previous boost for the left in Germany. The last big boost for the communists over here was Vietnam. Because communists were able to dominate the narrative about Vietnam. To them it was not a communist invasion. It was defending against world imperialism, Western imperialism, defending against capitalism. And so this caused quite a stir in Western Germany. So you had new communist stars, influencers. The universities were bursting full with these communist events, and they were chanting Ho Chi Minh, Ho Chi Minh, and they wanted to shake up everything, and they used Vietnam, well, let's say America's involvement in Vietnam, they used that as a launching board, and it was kind of the same after 9/11 and the war on terror.
Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
Same thing.
The White House.
Yeah, same thing.
This book. Jan Schena, he actually says this exact same thing. 1982, the high-level communist defector from Czechoslovakia, Jan Schena, he wrote this book in 1982. It was published in the UK. He said just what you said, that the Vietnam was the model that they wanted towards the end of their law. He talks about their long-range strategy the way Galitzin did, and he talked about faking the collapse of the Warsaw Pact alliance. And he says in here that they want all these brushfire wars. They want America to get involved in multiple Vietnams because they could capitalize on that.
Yeah, and so it was not just the left which used the war on terror to move us closer to Russia. It was also the truthers. It was, the conspiracy, the conspiracy activist movement, and now. A couple of days ago.
This is when we heard that them saying, suddenly the right wing is talking about the military-industrial complex the way the left did during the 60s.
Exactly. And a few days ago, I think it was on Thursday, there was this interview posted on Twitter or X. It was Tucker Carlson interviewing Alex Jones, who's actually banned on Twitter, but he may be able to get back on Twitter now. And so I looked at this interview and I took some notes. And I had previously noticed, of course, what Jones was doing, with his Russian propaganda, and I noticed what Tucker Carlson Tucker Carlson was doing, and how the Russians would actually play Tucker Carlson's clips on Russian television, and they had this internal memo in the Russian broadcasters to take these Tucker Carlson clips and play them, just as hard as they possibly could. And so I recently did a report on a major German influencer, a man called Mr. Seipel. I mean, Americans don't know this guy, but they probably will know him when they look at this case. So this was a very famous guy, very influential, millions of people reading his books over here and watching
his on state TV. This guy's face was all over TV.
State TV, yeah. His stuff was being watched millions of times by Germans. And this Seipel character, he was this Seipel character was always very anti-American. Very, very anti-American, and people forgave him that because of the reverberations of the old Vietnam era protests and stuff. So people thought this was normal, right? Very anti-American, very pro-Russian, and so he had these award-winning books. He had these major television reports on Putin and the Russian regime and Gazprom and all of this stuff. And not only was he so famous, he had unprecedented access to Mr. Putin himself. You see, when nobody else could get close to Putin like that, or almost nobody, especially not a journalist, he was on a weekend hunting trip. With Vladimir Putin and his personal entourage. So they showed the footage. I think it was Siberia. They were landing planes. They were getting into, and I kid you not, they were getting into Toyota Land Cruisers, Japanese cars, right? So they were driving into the forest. They hunted some animals and roasted them over an open fire, and then just, ate the meat like the cowboys they always wanted to be. And it was in Siberia, and of course. And so he was joining Putin on the hunting trip. He was riding in Putin's limousine. They were speaking German with each other because Vladimir Putin is fluent in German. And this particular television report was so bad that internally, as we now know, there was a lot of concern with state television. They thought he had gone too far and he's suspicious. And so he was giving you this whole dog and pony show in this program and
he denied taking any money from the Russians.
Sure. He was asked on state-run radio, did you ever take Russian money or money from Russia? And he was getting mad. He was saying, how dare you? How can you even insinuate? Are you crazy? Now we know he took Russian money, and in his television piece,
of Russian money.
Yeah,
Tell him how much.
Yeah, it was. He had a sponsoring contract, as they called it, for 600,000 euros just for one project, and we suspect there were more of these contracts. So who knows what the total final tally was? But he was getting.
And it was arranged through a front company via Cyprus, where the Russians do their banking.
Yeah, it was.
Right?
It was a well-known Russian oligarch who had been involved in America as well. He. I think it was steel industry in I forgot the cities. He was getting loans from, I think, the U.S. Department of Energy or something. So this Russian guy was also involved in America, and so this was a front company, and they were handling the sponsoring contract, and this was done in Cyprus, which is basically like a Russian money laundering machine with nice weather, and so. He got this money, 600,000 euros, 600,000 euros for a single book project, and that was on top of the royalties he made from the publishing company. So imagine
books are best-selling books, aren't they?
Yeah. So imagine you're selling tens of thousands of copies, and you're getting paid for all this. You're getting paid for all the stuff you do, And on top of that money and the advance that they gave you, on top he gets 600,000 euros of sponsoring money. And so in his famous, in his latest book, he advocated we should abandon America. America is a bad leader. America is horrible. We need the Russians. We totally need the Russians. That's his message. And in his famous Putin documentary, he made these points. Russia is not going back to communism. That's the point he wanted to make. And he also said that it's not fascism what's happening in Russia, because the Russians are the anti-fascists because they defeated the Nazis. And they tell the backstory of Putin's parents and the dead brothers in Leningrad. When the Nazis tried to take the city of Leningrad.
The siege of Leningrad. Yeah, his brother died.
So this guy, this Seipel guy, he was telling a German audience, it's okay. The Russians are not communists. They're not fascist. In fact, they're anti-fascist. And here comes the real bad thing. They are, in this documentary, they are telling you, in one moment, they're telling you about how the Nazis attacked Russia. Then they give you some judo footage of Putin. And then they talk about, NATO's missile shield and how Russia feels threatened by this missile shield. So it sounds to me like
threatened because NATO can shoot down Russian missiles coming at NATO.
So if you forget about if you cut out this judo footage in between those 2 points, it almost sounds to me as if they're saying that NATO today is like the Nazis in the past. Doesn't that sound familiar? This is exactly the narrative we got with the Ukraine invasion, that it's just like the Nazis. NATO is attacking us, just like with the Nazis.
And you know what? For all those experts that have been saying, "Oh, Putin changed because of our behavior in 2006, 2007."
No,
Putin was frustrated. He tried to work with us. If you go back and you look, Putin made a speech in, I believe it was 2001, June 22nd. You can look it up. That is on the 60th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. He made a speech in which he basically said NATO was a fascist alliance, just as dangerous as Germany, plotting to destroy Russia. Yeah. Now that's in 2001. That is in the second year of his presidency. He became president at the last day of 1999. And he was formally elected, I think, in March of 2000. So this is he's been president for a year and a half, almost a year and a half. And he makes the speech, and you can analyze it. It's right there. You can look it up.
And I've mentioned this in a previous show, that this is a very, very old narrative by the Russians. So this goes back to Alexander Nevsky defending against the invading German Teutonic Knights and what was the other group? The Swedish or the Livland Order?
Charles the XII invaded in the Great Northern War, invaded Russia and almost destroyed Russia.
So this is their trauma. So they hate white people, and to them, white people are all Nazis. And so this is what they're talking about. So in this 2012 documentary, it sort of kind of sounded like, NATO is the new Nazis. Now they're not saying this explicitly. Maybe this is all just a coincidence that, they put some judo footage of Putin in between those 2 points. But, and this just fits right into this current narrative that we see about Ukraine. So it's Russia is defending against Nazis.
And in fact, it's very Stalinist, because if you go back to the way behind closed doors, Stalin and his generals were talking about Germany during the period of the Non-Aggression Pact, 1939 to 41, before the German attack. They referred to them as the fascist bloc or alliance, and they were always discussing this possibility of war. And we know now the evidence is becoming increasingly persuasive that not only Viktor Suvorov, but other writers, the German writer who first presented the theory, was that the Soviet Union lured Hitler into a trap and then were preparing to stab Germany in the back. That the German claim that they were actually preempting a Russian invasion was not just nonsense, that there was truth in it, and that Hitler had read when he met Molotov in November of 1940. He was so infuriated that he knew he was being betrayed by Stalin. And in fact, Stalin biographers show that Stalin even knew that he was betraying Hitler, because he would comment, "Oh, if I'd only stayed with Hitler, like it was his choice," that the relationship went bad in that partnership. Yeah. But it's funny, the Russians have it both ways. They were partners. I had somebody on my blog say, "Oh, America's fascists. They're working and helping Nazis." Oh, you mean like Stalin in 1939 helping Hitler, sending him all that fuel and all that wheat?
Yeah. So now when I look at Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones, and now they're buddies, or at least Tucker Carlson pretends to like Jones and respect Jones. I mean, they made quite a bit of money, obviously. I mean, Tucker was very successful at Fox News, and he seems to be doing okay now financially. And Alex Jones for a long time made quite a bit of money. And so they didn't necessarily need Russian money, okay?
Although Jones got sued for $1 billion, and he might need a lot right now.
Yeah, now he very badly needs money, Mr. Jones. And I've mentioned this before, that Alex Jones was offered political asylum in Russia on TV, on Solovyov's show. So Solovyov told him, and this is on the web, you can find this. Solovyov was saying to Jones, come to Russia with your whole family. We'll put you in a nice, great house. You're going to be able to broadcast from this big studio here, and this is all going to be so cool. I mean, I don't remember. Maybe you remember a case. Because I don't remember a case from the Cold War. I don't remember a case when somebody was offered asylum like this on television. In that fashion. And so
nothing's coming to mind.
Yeah,
but,
because it's so crazy. And so I don't know if there's any sponsorship contracts, like we saw with this Seipel guy. I don't know if Jones has a sponsorship contract. I don't know if Tucker Carlson has a sponsorship contract with the Russians, but maybe the Russians got those two guys for free. Maybe they just got them for free, because they say the same things.
The effectiveness of Russian active measures and Russian control of our thinking, that it goes back to Tim Grosclose, what I talked about at the beginning, left turn. We're talking about right-wing figures here, Tucker Carlson and of course Alex Jones. And these figures are taking up the narratives of Russia, which is not really, it's a fake right-wing country, because it's aligned with China. It's aligned with Venezuela and communist Cuba. Putin gave 25 million tons of wheat to 2 years in a row to Cuba to make sure they got through the national grain shortage problem because of the Ukraine invasion. So here we have people who are ostensibly right-wingers, taking up themes that were themes of the left in the 1960s and 70s, very clearly, very openly, and being accepted and having huge followings among the right, where people are just absolutely devoted. And if I say anything negative at a party or somewhere about these figures, I'm the one that's now on the outside looking. I'm the one who's ostracized then.
Right, and so I have some of the notes here from that interview that happened or was posted on Thursday.
The interview that Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, the Tucker Carlson Alex Jones interview, and the only real new bit of information was volunteered by Mr. Jones, I think, at the end of the interview. And this came as a surprise, I think, to Tucker Carlson, judging from his reaction. Jones said that he received 2 new subpoenas. And Tucker was asking, oh, really? What for? And I think it was January 6th, the Capitol thing. And the other one is connected to Georgia. And so this surprised the heck out of Tucker Carlson. And this basically describes the problems that you get with people like Jones. And I want to stress the point. Jones may be maybe at the end of his career. Maybe he'll do more things and get votes for the Republican Party, because that's what this is all about. I mean, Tucker Carlson, he wants the votes. You know, he needs to play nice with Alex Jones's followers because he still has many followers, and they're supposed to vote Republican. But when Alex Jones continues his career, or if he continues his career, or he gets replaced by other people that are just like him, what are the downsides for not just the Republican Party, but conservatives in general? What damage can this cause? You know, and
this gets us into the scissor strategy game the Russians play, because the Russians have people on the American left and the American right. They can direct them, they can orchestrate them in a scissor strategy. What's a scissor strategy? It's scissors, you have 2 blades, right? Let's just say left and right. People say, oh, left and right doesn't matter anymore. Well, it does.
It does.
These 2 blades, they're angry with each other. There's a divide in this country, and they're angry with each other. And if those blades close, they can control the whole way that the narrative unfolds and the conflict unfolds, so that the issues they want attention to are gotten first. Everything else is kind of eclipsed, but also they are able to destroy anyone who's outside the conflict dynamic they've created. Yeah. So, for example, in the case of Jones, I'll give you an example. So they called Jones. The Russians here are asking Jones to come to Russia to escape. He's being called on the 1-6 to testify, and he's being sought as a suspect. Okay, so now look at what's at stake. If Jones then feels like he's going to be arrested and jailed, and we know that people related to this are just jailed and they're thrown away the key, and there's all kinds of weird things happening here, because guess what? The Marxists are in the Justice Department, so you're not going to get a fair hearing. But at the same time, Jones is being basically manipulated by the Russians, just like Tucker Carlson is being manipulated. So he's being manipulated. There's pro-Russian. So he gets scared and he flees then under accusation to Russia, which basically makes him a Russian agent, because now he's defected to the Russians. And what does that do to his followers and the whole right wing? It again makes it possible for Biden, I believe is a Russian agent, strongly suspect him. That means that Biden gets to posture as anti-Russian and look at his opposition as all their Russian agents, which is complete deception. This is absolutely deceptive, but it advances the scissors strategy so that controlling both sides in the conflict brings you to the resolution that whoever wins, right or left, they're under Russian influence.
Yeah, and so I mean, anybody. I mean, I'm almost 40 years old, so I do remember sort of the golden era of Jones's enterprise. You know, which was sort of during the Bush era. You know, this was when Jones became really known, and he did have. At the time, he had left-wing guests on. I think it was Cindy Sheehan. I think it was Cynthia McKinney. He was telling people to, he was telling people to avoid the Republican Party. To him, the Republicans were the tool of the New World Order conspiracy. So this is kind of the old idea: the United Nations will take over the United States and put the Patriots into internment camps and all of that stuff.
And of course, there was Russia and China had no place in that general scheme, did they?
Yeah, I mean, this was, I mean, in the '90s. If I mean, I was a a young teenager in the '90s. But if when I went back later and looked at the conspiracy media of the 1990s, nobody was really talking about Russia. As if Russia doesn't exist. They weren't really talking about China either. The focus was on America. So you were supposed to distrust just everything. And so then when 9/11 happened, Jones had this massive push. He was becoming quite popular, and he was using
Yeah,
the
he said
internet.
9/11 was an inside job, and it lost him a lot of his audience initially.
Yeah,
But he
yeah,
went and fought uphill, and he went up, and he got his audience back. And
yeah.
now, most of these Americans, most of these people from that group, from MAGA, I think if you did a poll, a huge percentage, I don't know, a third, maybe more, believe that 9/11 was an inside job. And that's a huge number of Americans who believe their own government did 9/11, which is, by the way, it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, for during that Bush era, Jones didn't do much about Russia. I mean, he did call Putin a demon. He did call him a former KGB asset. Jones talked about the 1999 apartment bombings in Russia. So there was some of that.
Yeah, he
But
would mention that in passing, but it
yeah,
wasn't really his staple. It wasn't his staple, and it was very
and
interesting. It's
his
almost
yeah,
as if he got taken over by degrees
and
in his
his
thinking.
and remember his reports on 9/11 at the time, and the whole thing with Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and all their backstory. His reports sounded pretty much like left-wing reports. So you didn't get the picture of Russia being involved in radical Islam. And Islam was, I believe, the second largest religion in the Soviet Union. And so there's all this backstory of Islamist networks, all this backstory with Russia. But what Jones did sounded like left-wing material, because there was quite a bit of left-wing material. I mean, there was even Michael Moore doing a left-wing movie on 9/11. I think it was called Fahrenheit 9/11. And so
Yes,
Jones, this was not exclusive stuff that Jones had
right.
done. I think the only bit of original journalism he's ever done was the infiltration of the Bohemian Grove, which was
It's kind of
interesting,
a
but
joke. Yeah,
it
it's
was
kind of a
somewhat, it
joke.
was, at least it was a real bit of journalism. But this was kind of the last thing he's done in journalism, and the rest was just being in his office and having his office people collect material for his show and his movies. And this was sourced from sometimes pro-Russian sources, sometimes left-wing sources. This very limited narrative that, well, the United States once worked with the Mujahideen. Yeah, why did they work with the Mujahideen? To force out the Russians out of Afghanistan. And so this actually worked back then, just like it would work now in Ukraine. You can drive out the Russians without, the world blowing up. It's possible. It's been done before. And some people, they don't even know this. They say, well, you cannot expect a superpower like Russia to withdraw from the Ukraine. That is unthinkable. Well, it happened before. It happened
Yeah,
before.
it's
Don't,
unthinkable. Russia's victory is inevitable. This is the thing that really troubles me, Alex, is going back to what you said earlier, that the collapse of communism was really the collapse of anti-communism. That basically what you had with the collapse of communism was the collapse of the actual resistance. And once Russia could depict itself as a normal country, people like Jones might call Putin a dictator, but they were going to be drifting in that direction as conspiracy theory was leveraged to make them anti-American. Because conspiracy theory is to make the West look like it's a giant conspiracy to pauperize everyone, or to now exterminate, lower the world's population to 500 million people. This is the narrative that it's the evil West, it's evil NATO, it's the Jewish conspiracy becomes a conspiracy of the banksters or the Western elites, and this is now believed, not just by people on the left now who were talking like this in the 60s and about the military industrial complex, but people on the right. And it's clearly been coming from people under Russian influence, like Carlson, like Alex Jones.
Yeah, and if when I remember the Bush era, the Bush years, this is when the internet was still somewhat new. I mean, some people were going online in the year 2000, or they just started to use the internet more in the following years, and then it became more it was easier to share audio files and even video files. I mean, the quality was bad back then, but still, you could move files. And this is when the first video platforms started. Google had a platform called Google Video that nobody seems to remember. This was before, the acquisition of YouTube. And so this was early social media. And you saw these conspiracy videos at the time. You saw them hit the top 10 constantly.
Very popular.
These movies became insanely popular, and nobody could really explain why. I mean, if some young kids made a documentary on 9/11, I think it was called Loose Change, that was, why would it become such a phenomenon? Why would Jones's material become such a phenomenon so quickly? Especially with
the disinformation networks of the Russians and their friends were helping them.
Yeah, especially with these platforms, because we know from experience and from operations that are now public, we know how the Russians play this game. They will latch onto anything that's anti-American, and they will promote anything that's anti-American.
Through their troll farms. Their
troll farms. And back in those days, it was much harder for these social media companies and video companies. It was much harder to filter out real visits or real access to these videos. So you could use automated bot systems, these little programs that kept reloading these videos and basically pretending to be a human, clicking on all these videos again and again and again, pretending to watch these videos. Nowadays, it's become harder with these robot programs, but they can still use human networks. They can still have people in an office building, real people with real accounts, clicking on these videos and pretending to watch them. So it's a big question of why Jones became so successful in the 2000s and some others. Why this stuff became so popular. And I have a quote here from the Tucker interview with Jones. It's okay, and I quote directly from the transcript. It says, "And I'll just confess," this is Tucker speaking, "and I'll just confess that I first heard of Alex Jones when he questioned the official story behind 9/11, and I, speaking for myself, was deeply offended by this. I didn't take any time to find out what he was saying, but I was bothered by the idea that this defining event in American history, which changed the life of everyone who lived here then, might not actually have unfolded as we were told it did, and that possibility was too destabilizing. And I remember feeling resentment toward Alex Jones for saying that." And now Tucker has changed his opinion, apparently. And now he's acting real friendly towards Alex Jones. So part of this is
Douglas McGregor, who's been an incredible Russian mouthpiece. So obvious, so horribly dishonest in his coverage of the Ukraine war that it's unspeakable. And it's unbelievable that Carlson sticks with him and keeps doing interviews with him, which are more and more egregious. It's just, but yet the common folk are sucking it up. They're believing it because they came to trust Tucker Carlson on Fox News.
Yeah, because he can say things about the left, about the overt left and trash the overt left, which is easy to do, right? But and that's how he builds up his credibility. But what do the people do once the communists pretend to be something else? This is when people start to fail in their understanding and their assessments. And then
people seem to only believe what appears in the open. They're never able to look behind or see into things. And this goes to something Machiavelli said in The Prince. Machiavelli said that if you lie and you deceive and you trick people, you're going to be very successful in politics because everyone sees what you appear to be. Few people are in close touch with you to know what you really are, and those few dare not gainsay the many. This is an exact quote from The Prince. And this is what we see. It really does work like that.
Yeah, and you could tell throughout the whole interview that Alex Jones was not prepared. It was just rambling. It's almost a bit schizo how he jumps from one topic to the next, how he's stringing together these allegories. I mean, one moment he's comparing himself to a shrimp fisherman from a historic Texas flood. And in the next moment, he says his uncle was part of Iran-Contra, and then he's off to the next thing, and he's talking about flying bombers getting shot at, and he compares himself to all these things, and you can see the look on Tucker Carlson's face. I mean, he's basically questioning what's going on here, and
was Jones confusing himself with one of Forrest Gump's friends?
Well, I mean, people did notice.
What was that?
people did notice over time that Jones's delivery became weird. I mean, he's been working in broadcast for so long. He should be good with words. He should be prepared for an important interview. He should have a concept. He should do a pre-interview, and he should be able to have a proper conversation and add something to the conversation and know about these topics. But does he have a drug problem? Because when we saw him on Joe Rogan, Alex Jones, they drank on that show. It was like a 4-hour thing. I've watched it. And then they smoked pot. And of course, if you remember Jones in the 90s, and I was young enough to have followed him a bit back then, he depicted himself as a Christian, evangelical Christian from Texas, a conservative, a sort of a traditional conservative. And here he's made this transition all the way to being on Joe Rogan, smoking pot, talking about aliens. Yeah,
right?
And Joe Rogan, I mean, he even says about himself that he's very left on many topics. So this is directly from Joe Rogan. He said, "I may look like a Republican, but I'm not." I think he even said he never voted Republican in his life. He grew up poor, and that sort of made him susceptible for socialist ideas, I think. But yeah, I mean, Jones has been alluding to things over the years. I mean, he's talked about certain medications that he takes for his allergies that may or may not be something like ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, which is a stimulant, basically. This is just me speculating based on what he's saying. So he talked
Would
about.
That explain his weight gain over the years?
Well, he has. I mean, he talked about sleep problems. So he's been busy for so long, he said, and he oftentimes he only got a few hours of sleep each night. He had a sleep problem, so he may or may not have been treating that or whatever with sleep medication. But
or self-medicating with other things?
Who knows? I mean, he talked about drinking buckets of what he called nuclear coffee. So he was overdosing on caffeine for a while. You see him with a cigarette at the beginning of the interview, standing in front of an outhouse for whatever reason. So you see him with a cigarette, and he's been talking about his sleep problems and his allergy medications, and of course, his drinking has been in the press. I mean, there were some big newspapers that talked to his former employees, and they were talking about his drinking. There's quite a bit of information out there, and so yeah, I mean, he's also talked about, you know, hallucinations for some reason. I mean, he mentioned the drug DMT a lot, which has become popular. It's
Explain to the audience what that is.
well, unfortunately, nowadays you can buy DMT on the internet. This has become sort of a popular thing with some libertarian influencers and conspiracy influencers. It's comparable to LSD. It's I think it's a white powdery substance, and you can smoke that, and then you have a very intense but not very long rush. So you have severe hallucinations. Everything feels extremely intense, and this doesn't last very long. So this is something that even busy people can try, you know, business people or media people, because if you take LSD, that can keep you busy for hours, and other drugs, they can keep you busy for even longer than that. But he's been talking a lot about DMT and these sort of things and his own hallucinations. I think he even mentioned on the Joe Rogan program that he has these regular hallucinations for whatever reason. And but he said that he's not taking, I think he explicitly said he's not taking DMT. If you believe him, that's a whole nother question. So he's made these statements over the years. And I just caught little bits and pieces of this stuff every now and then. So yeah, I mean, he built this company, had up to, I think, 80 something employees. So this is when they made millions and millions in revenue, but it's still a lot of work, and there's still risk involved. So it's a lot of stress, and he's not really handling that stress without substances. So this is just speculation at this point. And there was also an incident. I remember that when, and this is in the press, you can find it on the web, when he had a DUI. He had a DUI, and I think he blew a, what was it in American? I think it's a 0.079, I think it was. So it was just a hair below the legal limit, because we have a different system over here in Germany. We have the metric system, we say it in a different way, what the blood alcohol level is. And so he had like a 0.79. It was just below the legal limit, and that triggered his ex-wife because they have a custody battle, had this custody battle for a long time, and this has been public. And so I think there was a demand for him to give a hair sample, just to make sure that he's behaving. He had to, I think there was a request for a drug test, his hair test. And curiously enough, for whatever reason, suddenly he appeared on his own show bald. Some people may remember this. This is not too long ago. He was suddenly very, very, very bald. Completely bald. Not just half bald, but completely bald. I mean, I don't know why he was bald all of a sudden, but it doesn't really raise my trust level with this man. And so yeah, I mean, during the Fox, during the Bush era, Fox would not touch the conspiracy stuff. But now we've seen Fox, getting into this, Fox trying to, get the conspiracy audience to watch and to vote Republican. And now Tucker Carlson is playing nice with Alex Jones. And we've just seen Elon Musk considering letting Alex Jones back on the platform with Twitter, which is now called X. So I think everybody's playing nice with everybody for the votes, to get people to vote Republican. But what is the danger of having these people around like Carlson and Jones? With Elon Musk. Elon Musk has said some not so good things about Ukraine, and he's just not an expert on the topic whatsoever. Elon has defense contracts with the SpaceX company and the Starlink internet. Elon has respect for the military industrial complex, as it's been called. He does have a respect for it, and it just seems to me that Elon, for the longest time in his life, he's a very busy man. He's spent all this time in university, then the corporations, and so he didn't really have the time to get into politics and history. So nowadays, he seems almost like a 20-year-old who just found, baseline conspiracy literature, baseline conservative literature, who just discovered, books like libertarian books like The Road to Serfdom. And so he's kind of in a honeymoon phase with his newfound ideology. But I think that everybody else is trying to use Elon for their own purpose. They want Elon to push this Russian stuff. They want Elon to push, Carlson and Jones and all that stuff. And it's possible that because Elon Musk is on very friendly terms with Joe Rogan, who is sort of a lefty, but Rogan is being influenced by other people when it comes to topics such as COVID and the Russians and this and that. So yeah, who knows who has the key influence over Elon's political ideas right now. I can't really tell, but we'll see how that goes. Here's an example from this Tucker Jones interview. This is from the transcript. They talk about Israel and the attack, the Hamas attack against Israel. And this is what's in the transcript. There's no way that one of the best intelligence agencies in the world, they probably refer to the Mossad and the Shin Bet, didn't know what was coming. The massive buildup, the 5,000 missiles, the paragliding attacks, all of that. So they're insinuating that what exactly? Netanyahu knew the exact attack that was coming, and he knew when it was coming, and he let it happen for what? So Israel would look vulnerable, and to have a conventional war that could expand to fighting Iran. What are they insinuating? This has been in the press over and over again. Of course, Hamas was always preparing attacks, and of course, Israel was gaining intelligence about that, but the Israelis, they just didn't know the scale of the coming attack, when it's coming, and exactly where it's coming. So, because, the Muslims over there, they might feign an attack here and then attack somewhere else. So, the Israelis didn't have the full picture. Surely Alex Jones doesn't have the full picture or any idea of what he's talking about, but they're just insinuating that it was a false flaggy thingy-majingy, let it happen on purpose, so that Netanyahu let this happen. This is what they're saying in the interview on Twitter in front of millions of people watching.
Yeah, that's the influence, and this is how we get to this whole situation where our right is beginning to sound like the left. I've tried to kind of explain to people that MAGA has this going on inside of it, that this is part of what's happening. And they very strongly, they viscerally reject it. They don't stop and think, hey, wait a minute. Like Tim Gross-Close says, the right has been moving to the left. The left has been going further to the left. People regularly leave the Democratic Party because it's too left and go over to the Republicans because they're where they used to be. It's like Jimmy from Brooklyn has a statement that he makes about communism, about what the communists themselves say. This is a slogan from their own literature. Today's left is tomorrow's center.
Yeah.
Today's center is tomorrow's. In other words, the center is becoming the left. The left. Now you hear, I heard people who are very far to the left, this is 10 years ago or more, describing themselves as centrists, people who I would think, you're really kind of cozying up
Yeah.
to the radical left in your beliefs. And it's so much so that if you are not going along with the political correctness, you're out of step, you're wrong, you're an extremist to not have their extreme views. And this is what has really happened to us. And it's like the frog being boiled, the classic story. We always hear about it, everybody knows. But what the people on the right who talk about the frog being boiled don't realize is they're being boiled and they don't even see it. And they know about the boiling of the frog.
And so then there's this very important nugget in the transcript. It says Hamas is being funded by Hezbollah, which is Iran. We just had Biden a month ago give $6 billion to Iran, and now the mullahs are bragging that they were behind the attack. Hezbollah funding Hamas. Okay, wait a minute. Behind Iran stands Russia, mainly. So, they're not saying that, which they should, but even what they say is probably already too much for their Russian friends, because the Russians don't want this narrative out there that Iran was masterminding this attack against Israel. That's not the narrative the Russians necessarily want out there. Okay. And so this was kind of one of those crazy moments in the interview when they show they don't even know what they're talking about, or they just have no real understanding of these conflicts. I mean, they sound like street level activists. They sound like their own fans, who listen to this stuff every now and then. This is kind of the level of competence you can expect from these people. And so that makes them replaceable, highly replaceable. I mean, if those two vanish from the face of the earth tomorrow, if they get struck by lightning tomorrow, they can be replaced in a second. They can be replaced by other people who say the exact same things.
Same things, yes. And this is the thing that people don't understand. And pattern recognition is a big part of this. Those of us that know the history of communism and the Cold War, we've seen these themes from the time of Stalin, from the time of Khrushchev, from the time now. Communism is always reinventing itself to it's a moving target. You can't say what it is because they're always changing what it is. So now it's not even, they don't even use the word communism. They don't like it. And you'll hear people say, oh, China's a capitalist country. They're not really communist. And there's all this confusion because actually there is no communist economic system. That's always a myth. It's state capitalism. It always was. And it is today, basically. So that when people say, oh, they're free enterprise, no, they're not. It's the same totalitarian structures. They've been modified and adapted, particularly to do business with the West, to get credits and money to build up their militaries while they're infiltrating our politics, bribing our businessmen with business contracts, bribing our politicians, compromising people. And we have people, you talked about, Schroeder and Scholz and Angela Merkel as being communist-connected German leaders ever since Kohl and the breakup of the Soviet Union and the unification of Germany. We had 3 of the last 5 presidents, 3 who had close communist connections. The Clintons, Bill Clinton, traveled to Moscow in December 1969, went to communist Czechoslovakia when they were communist countries, had private meetings behind the scenes, rumored to have met with the Czech intelligence services. There was allegations from the defector Jan Šejna about this. There was, and I have the letters to prove it. and that Shayna was involved in these allegations. You had you had Barack Obama, who was mentored by Frank Marshall Davis, a card-carrying communist, who basically was involved with him when he was a teenager, mentoring him. Frank Marshall Davis, a black American communist from Chicago, who was then in Hawaii when Obama was. And then you have Biden, Obama's vice president. And Biden's history, you go to I've mentioned this again and again, you go to the Bukovsky papers, the file, you can see Biden's files from the Communist Party Soviet Union archive, where he's telling the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union, look, I have to sound like I'm against you, but I'm really your friend.
Yeah.
And this is documented from Soviet archives. He was their friend in 1979.
Yeah.
So how is he not their friend now? He just has to disguise it and pretend to be for Ukraine as he slowly pulls the rug out from under the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and
something a Republican.
Yeah, and something something that was really noticeable over the last couple of years was this new right-wing MAGA conspiracy type witch hunt. Now, there have been many cases of this. There was a student. This was a fairly recent case. It was in the media and the press. I forgot the name of the kid. He was a college student. A college student. He was Jewish, and he once said somewhere, he wants to work for the government, later. And someone on the internet accused him of being the same guy that did something bad, even though this completely separate people. But this became a thing on the internet, so people started to add stuff to this, witch hunt, and anything this kid said.
They were trying to destroy this kid.
Yeah, basically anything he would say would make it worse. So when he said,
why were they doing this to him? What line did he cross? Do you know?
No, he did absolutely nothing. It was just I think it was just a question of his photo looked like some other guy's photo, and that other guy was involved in something.
Oh, it was kind of a hysteria.
Yeah, so this was just total internet baloney, and this happened quite a bit. People compare photos and say, well, this white guy looks like that white guy, so they must be the same person. And so this was a completely nonsensical target, and whatever this kid said made it worse. And, these activists, they said, well, this kid is Jewish, so that's suspicious for them. And he said he wanted to work for the government, that's suspicious as well. So they had a target, and they tried to harass this kid, basically. And there's more instances, of course. And one of the most infamous instances of this was the Sandy Hook reports by Alex Jones and his people. So this was all over the media recently with the hearings or the court proceedings when Jones had to testify under oath, and his media people, they had to testify under oath. And there were previous video depositions under oath, and I watched them, or I listened to them while I was doing some jogging, some sports. I was listening to the stuff, and so what happened, the way I see the story, what happened was a mixture of sheer incompetence and opportunism. So this shooting happened. Of course, the left wanted to use it to implement new weapons laws, new restrictions. And so people were looking for a narrative, and they could have picked, InfoWars, others, they could have done solid reporting on the case. They could have said that this is not a reason, to have more stupid gun control. This was one of the craziest perpetrators in the country. Really, really weird shooter. This was just a horrible case. And maybe somebody overlooked something. Maybe some of these mental health professionals should have caught this earlier. You could have done some decent reporting on this and supported the Second Amendment. But these people on the internet, they started saying this was a false flag. This was fake. So the parents are not real of these dead children. They're not real. They're actors. And so they were looking on the web and finding anything that could prove that these people were actors. And they were claiming these kids are not really dead. And these kids were popping up somewhere else in the world. And this was all just fake.
Just like the 9/11 claim of the people in the plane that hit the Pentagon.
Or no planes. Some people said there were no planes at all in 9/11.
Yeah. Which is, by the way, I'm sorry if you believe that, but you need to really look at this closer because the evidence is quite open and shut.
Yeah,
on that, it's insane what people can be made to believe, because basically Gustav Le Bon was correct, and the Russians know this. If you repeat a lie over and over again, it becomes the truth in people's minds, especially if it appeals to something in them that they feel frustrated, they feel alienated, especially this feeling of alienation. This conspiracy theory, which is itself a kind of Gnostic revolutionary theory, takes control of people's minds. And it begins to lead them.
Yeah,
and the Russians know this. The Chinese know this.
Yeah, and so people were going through television footage. They were going through documents, and they went into this investigation with, it seems like, the goal to prove this conspiracy. So we were looking for anything that would support this viewpoint, and they were disregarding anything that contradicted what they wanted to find. And so then this kind of thing took off, and it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And these Sandy Hook parents, they were starting to get harassed. So they lost their children, and they were getting harassment. They were painted as the bad guys, working for, the banker globalist conspiracy. And so this was a time when there was still much of the conspiracy content on YouTube and other big social media platforms was not as, regulated. And so these new activists, conspiracy guys, they were starting to make videos on the cheap. They didn't have a fancy studio like Alex Jones. They didn't have a staff. They didn't have the latest and greatest, video and streaming equipment. They just had a cheap computer. They were stealing footage from news broadcasts, and they were just editing the stuff together. And then they posted this, and they got millions of views. So of course, this is bad business for somebody like Alex Jones, who had many employees on his payroll. And so they had to compete. They had more costs in producing this stuff, but they were competing with the new guys who were producing this material for next to nothing. And so then this idea became really popular, and then InfoWars were starting to do these reports as well. And so this is when it became a problem. And at some point, these lawsuits happened. And these lawsuits happened, and now these entire lawsuits are being painted as a big conspiracy. Okay, so yeah, of course, one of the lawyers who was going after Jones, with the famous moment when they had Jones's phone data, all of his phone data, because Jones's lawyer had made a mistake. So yeah, of course you have like this one lawyer who is a leftist, and then you have other people who have an interest in ruining Jones, of course. But still, this was just a very baseline, very baseline court case. You can say this stuff about other people and make money off of it. You just can't do that. And every amateur, everybody who's new in the journalism game knows you are responsible for every report you put out. So when it comes to investigative reporting, you have to be extra careful because you might get sued by someone. So everybody should know this. But now there's a witch hunt now for everything. So supposedly the judge is in on the conspiracy, the lawyers are in on the conspiracy. Alex is still saying things like, well, there were discrepancies. I was looking at the discrepancies. He's still trying to defend what he did. And so everything is a conspiracy. The judge is a target, the lawyers are a target, they're all the enemy. They're all part of this evil conspiracy to destroy poor Alex Jones. And so they could try this sort of witch hunt against anybody, really. I mean, they could just designate the next target and just have people, or just wait for people to harass the target. They could do this to anybody, anything that.
Yeah, and that's where we get into. I sent you a document here during the week from a literary agent of a man. I'm not going to say his name because I don't have permission to mention him, but he's a guy that worked in the Pentagon, worked in intelligence, who basically accidentally found or was shown a file on him that other people in the Pentagon had, and it was about how to derail his career, how to destroy him. And he was shocked, of course, that he was targeted. Now, he was a conservative. He wanted to defend the country. And the people that were putting this file together, he calls them the deep state. But in reality, the deep state of the communists who've infiltrated the state. That's my interpretation. And analysis is everything here, getting that right. And you will find this again and again. When you zero in on it, you find these people are basically following the lines of Russia, China, the communists. And I want to draw this attention to this because this is what Mark Levin and all these people who do use the word communism and talk about Marxism, they don't tie it to Russia. American Marxism, is what Levin talks about. Well, it's not. And Marxism, communism is a global movement. It's not just American. It's all interconnected. They're all working together, and they're working with Russia and China today. This is not, people, you're still in the Cold War. No, I'm not. I'm in reality. You're not keeping up. Those in the audience don't understand that. And the real evidence is when you see these connections, for example, what you're talking about, for example, with Alex Jones, Webster Tarpley was a guest on, right? Webster Tarpley connected to the LaRouche organization, right? Ostensibly a right-wing organization. And so he makes these multiple appearances on Jones, and he's talking about the conspiracy and about how horrible it is. And he's posturing as this right-winger. But then, it was 5-6 months after his last Jones appearance, maybe it was less, because I used to watch him on Jones because I was just fascinated.
Yeah.
This guy is really a Russian agent. But he shows up on this, it was in 2016, in June. He shows up on this this forum. I think it was held in New York, of all these leftists, these Antifa types, Antifa communist Marxist types. And he's clearly talking about how Trump is the guy that's going to help the left win because he's so bad. And there he had been just months later posturing with Jones, who was very pro-Trump as the LaRoucheite, and it's sort of like, well, I guess he doesn't have to play that role because he's got other people to fill that gap for him. So he's gone back over to his real camp, which is the Marxist-Leninist left. And that was Webster Tarpley. Is you go back, if they still have the Webster Tarpley interviews with Jones, Jones was like eating out of his hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have some notes here on the foundational strategy here of communism in the West. So I did this report on our Chancellor Olaf Scholz because when he was young, he was supporting various organizations. I mean, he made his big career with the Social Democrats, who pretend to be not hardcore communists, but he did support other organizations as well at the time. And for example, there was a well, there was a sub-organization, and they called themselves Stammokap, and that's short for Staatsmonopolistischer Kapitalismus. And this is kind of the term of Marxism-Leninism. This is how they describe the current state of capitalism. So they think it's in its final stages, and this final stage they call imperialism, and so it's doomed to fail, they say. And in this phase of current capitalism, there's the monopolies and the trusts, and it's all highly centralized. And so you would have to either have a violent revolution to take over these big corporations and to take over these cartels and the trusts. And then when you take them by force or by other means, you then already have a centralized system. So you actually benefit from the centralization that happened earlier in capitalism. So the communists can then take over these well-established organizations. So this was their idea, either done by force or by covert means and more regulation. So if you start to regulate this, then you have to regulate that, then you have to regulate the prices of the source materials, the price of the electricity, and then the end consumer price. And at some point, you are regulating everything. And so this is how the alternative plan to have bureaucrats ultimately run everything. And so this Stammokap theory is based on the writings of a man called Rudolf Hilferding. Nobody remembers that guy. Maybe the German left. Nobody remembers Rudolf Hilferding, but his writings were actually copied, so to say, by Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin ripped off that guy and published his own text, which is called The Imperialism as the Highest or the latest stage of capitalism. So this was how that went. And if you go back to the original text by Rudolf Hilferding, it was called Das Finanzkapital from 1910. Mm-hmm. And so he was talking about how in capitalism, larger companies, they swallow up smaller companies, and you have this centralization. And so this capitalism, they say, becomes a sort of planned capitalism because it's so full of monopolies and cartels, they will eventually talk to each other. And then you have this small group of industrialist dynasties, and they then rule capitalism, a planned form of capitalism. And so the left wants to take that stuff away from them, keep the stuff intact, but then have it run by bureaucrats. So they will actually benefit, the communists will then actually benefit from the previous centralization within capitalism. This is how they explained it. And and then they talk about this Hilferding, and then of course Lenin later, they talked about how they wanted to regulate more and more until you have to regulate everything. And obviously the climate change thing is the perfect pretext to start regulating everything. And what I noticed over the last years, I mean, you did have conservative groups, Republican groups, you did have those groups fighting against this climate nonsense. But for some reason, they weren't really fighting well enough or overall enough, I think. And now you see, for example, Elon Musk. You see Elon Musk preaching climate change, and that's why he started
his bothered me.
His electric car company. Yeah, mm-hmm. that's and now he has an electric car company. Why would you spend $60,000 or less or more on his cars, when you could have a much cheaper car with a gasoline engine or a diesel engine. So the only reason really to buy a Tesla is if you have enough money and you want to drive really fast and have a lot of torque, or you care about climate change, right? And so Elon Musk is preaching climate change, and he relies on the science, he says. But it's the same argument of Greta Thunberg. I mean, Greta Thunberg knows nothing about climate science. She just refers to climate science. And also Elon, I think, has never even touched climate science, because it's a very, very specific field, and there are many, many different sciences involved, and it's hyper complicated, and you cannot really predict the future with a piece of software. By acquiring Twitter, Elon has become the new darling of the right wing, and they forgive him that he's for climate change and that he builds electric cars, and they forgive him everything. And he's trolling the left, he's talking about this and that, and he's trolling Disney, and that's fine. But it's just I've seen this over the last couple of years when the Ford Motor Company now says they want to be climate neutral at a certain date, a certain date in the future. They want to be climate neutral. And you see some of these other larger companies, even oil companies, they're trying to get into the green thing. So what the heck's going on?
Hmm. Yeah, it's the part of the general influence operation that we're talking about. It's all of a piece. It's all part of the same thing. And what people can't do, who don't know, they know something's going on. So the conspiracy theory appeals to them because it's simple, and you don't have to know anything. But it's this. It's what Galitzin talked about the long-range strategy. And communists are always strategizing since the time of Lenin. And it's you talk about the UFO thing that's coming up that's so suspicious. That's also, I was reading Carla Turner. And of course, I had worked with Joe Douglas on a book that he did on chemical mind control weapons. And you read this UFO book by these abductees, and you think, were these people exposed to a chemical substance that caused them to have these visionary experiences, this contact with these entities? Have we been the guinea pigs subject to mind control drugs or experimental drugs that can cause people to have experiences, bizarre experiences, and that this can be fed into this conspiracy, because there's conspiracy narratives, there's apocalyptic prophecies, and there's also left-wing New Age themes going into
and there was this was in the press recently. This was, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, or maybe it was another publication. They did this report on tech firm heads and managers, how they go to the Burning Man festival, how they microdose psychedelic drugs, and
these are drugs we don't fully understand what kind of experience. People take those drugs. I had a friend, he took these drugs when he was young, and he had what he would call a religious experience. He had some kind of visionary experience, which he believed was very real. Okay, it might be real. It might open, the doors of perception. It might open up your perceptions. But this opening is not to something that's necessarily benign. And I turn again to Carla Turner, or you talk to Whitley Strieber's books. Were these people given a drug that led to these experiences? And it's funny, it happens to families. Well, what do families do? They share the same food. They share the same water supply. Maybe they were dosed. I mean, it's starting to occur to me as I'm thinking about the mind control drugs, thinking about these bizarre experiences that people are having. And it's like, is this part of the chemical warfare together with the biological warfare that's been operating, because it all kind of fits this general strategy of an assault on Western civilization.
Yeah, and I got some notes here as well on some notes on Elon Musk and his very, very interesting ancestors, actually.
No, he's South African, right?
Yeah, and well, this is yes and no. So I wanted to look into his family to find to find something that would shed light on his view on technocracy, right? Because technocracy is this idea that scientists run everything or engineers run everything. Now, of course, this may be an appealing concept if you're an engineer or a scientist or you employ engineers, but this concept has failed, or this baseline idea has failed in the real world. So, for example, when Albert Einstein, when he went to the United States, the government wouldn't let him near the atomic program, the Manhattan Project. Why? Because he was a communist. Because despite his high-level IQ, he was average when it came to languages, and he was terrible when it came to politics and history and the empires. So
yeah, if anybody's read Einstein's book, one of his political book, it's very childish.
Yeah, it's infantile. It's infantile, and he was not the only example. I mean, you did have atomic scientists also very high IQ, like the Rosenbergs, but they were morons when it came to the Soviet Union, and they became traitors. And they went to the electric chair. They had the choice, spill the beans, life in prison, or the electric chair. They picked the electric chair. How stupid is that? How stupid it is, was it to spy for the Soviets and give them atomic secrets? But, this is just, they were scientists. They were engineers. Yet they're not equipped to make decisions for larger societies. So this concept of technocracy can go really, really wrong. And so I was interested in Elon Musk and what he thinks about technocracy. And I discovered something that really interested me. So Elon was born in South Africa in Pretoria. So he cannot become legally the United States president, just so people are aware of that. And his ancestors were British and Dutch. And so his grandparents on his mother's side, they were adventurous, traveling the world. And his grandfather, he was a director of an activist group called Technocracy Incorporated. Okay. And this organization was inspired by a certain Howard Scott. Now, Howard Scott came from left-wing circles, left-wing and anarchist circles. And so this Mr. Scott, he got together with scientists from the Columbia University, such as Marion King Hubbard, and they all formed this technocracy movement. And this Hubbard was also working for the government, the Board of Economic Warfare, deciding about exports. And he also worked for the Shell Oil Company. So again, Elon's grandfather was in this activist group, or was a director of the activist group Technocracy Incorporated. And this was a group of high-level scientists, and there was also some real left-wing guys in that group. So then, as the name implies, Technocracy Incorporated was promoting a model of government or non-government led by scientists, especially engineers. So this would cut down waste, no more inefficiency in government, and it would also protect the environment. That's what they argued. And Scott said that the prices of goods should be determined by how much energy you need to make them. Now, obviously, there's a parallel.
The energy theory of value, other than the other, instead of the labor theory of value. This is an attempt. So whenever socialists dabble in economics, they depart from subjective value theory and they try these things, which of course you need a dictatorship to apply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to this day, and this goes back to the writings of Lenin and this older German Austrian dude, this Hilferding dude, they couldn't explain how communists would actually determine prices and wages. They just wobble and waffle around the baseline reality that you do have to make calculations. And every real-life communist regime, they had to calculate things precisely, or as best as they could, but they couldn't explain how to determine prices. If you asked them, or people like them, what's the price of a pack of cigarettes, and why does it cost precisely that? So a capitalist could say, well, sure, we produce or we buy the tobacco, and then we, have the machines and we turn them into cigarettes, and then we sell it, we determine the price, and we have different qualities, and we're going to expand the business so we can have better prices. And so you have a choice. You can buy this pack of cigarettes for $3, or you can buy this pack for $2, or you can buy a really nice one for $10. Do you want to buy them? Or do you not want to buy them? So this is how a capitalist would talk about these things. Now, these communists, Hilferding and Lenin, they make these weird sentences, just like Karl Marx. They make up these words. So, the production community needs to externalize the essence of the community and the production and this and that. So they make these ridiculous sentences because they just can't answer the question. They just tell you that, it's going to be government officials who will determine what your wages are going to be and what you can buy with it. And that's the end of it.
And there's a refusal to accept economic reality. And economics is a difficult subject all on its own. You have supply and demand, and things are valued by people based on their own individual choices. If you make the government make all the choices, you're taking the choices of life away from individuals. It is a form of despotism. In fact, economic despotism is the ultimate despotism because you're controlling people on a basic day-to-day level. And this is what makes the systems of government control of things, which is state capitalism, makes it so objectionable.
And just a few years later, Lenin again was publishing a text where he said that we have to rule, we have to be harsh and be this dictatorship because that's just what it is. Because if we're not that harsh, everything will fall apart. So that means, what's the price of a pack of what's the price of a pack of cigarettes? What's my hourly wage? What goods can I buy? Well, it's what Lenin tells you. It's what he dictates. And if you don't like it, if you think it's not enough money and the products stink, you can't say this. You have no other choice, and you can't complain because
Lenin
then
is a god. Basically.
Yeah, and if you complain,
this is an attempt to be God.
If you complain, if you're committing blasphemy against Lenin and the state, you get a visit from the secret police during the night. So this is how they determine the prices and the wages. And so these weird technocrats, involving the grandfather of Elon Musk, these technocrats, they thought, prices are determined by the amount of energy needed to produce them. Now, this is kind of the same as today's, CO2 emissions certificates. So
Yeah.
the
Which is
amount
going to destroy our
the
economies.
amount of CO2 produced, changes the price of the product and that sort of thing. And so these guys, these technocrats, involving some serious left-wing anarchists, they were promoting this idea, and this actually became really popular. And I mean really popular. I'll get to that in a second. So, or in fact, I'm going to get to this now. The heydays of this organization was the 1930s and the 1940s. This technocracy organization had more than 500,000 members. Okay, and a great influence for this organization was a man called Thorstein Veblen. Okay, some may have heard of this guy.
Thorstein Veblen he wrote a book, the leisure, the something of the leisure class back 100 plus years ago. He was kind of a socialistic social theorist in the U.S.
Yeah, and so he has Norwegian roots. He studied at Johns Hopkins and Yale, and he got together with researchers like John Dewey, who promoted this new school for social research, which arguably may have ruined the American school system, but that's another topic for another day.
It definitely did. Yes,
that's probably another topic for another day.
And Dewey was initially pro-Soviet until he visited there, and he didn't give up his socialist views, though.
Yeah, and basically these Yale guys like Dewey, they actually had ties to German researchers, and so these Germans, they were working on psychology and developmental psychology. And so if you take that research, you could use it for positive purposes, but you could also use it for nefarious purposes. So if you figure out, if you do this, the child will not develop in the right way, you can do some really bad stuff with that. And this is kind of
in fact, they have, and Robin Eubanks wrote a book called Educate. I think it's called Educated to Destroy, or Education to Destroy, something like that. And in Eubanks, her kids were coming home. She was a lawyer in Atlanta, Georgia. Her kids were coming home with these really strange lessons from school.
Reading.
And she wanted to know where this came from. Yeah. And so what she discovered was American educators had actually gone to the Soviet Union and gotten these lesson plans, all these ideas from the Soviet Union in the 1970s, brought it back to the United States. And she basically, it is a program to destroy the child's mind. And she lays this out, and she shows this in her book. And it's very detailed. And what she told me was that these documents were translated from Russian into English for the use by our educationists, by our people with PhDs in education here in the U.S., which basically got adopted state by state through all the education departments, guided by the National Education Department in the federal government. Basically went through all this because education was so infiltrated by the communists. It had been unchecked. They had discovered this actually as early as 1940. There was commissions in the states of New Jersey and New York that discovered massive communist infiltration of the secondary and primary schools, if you can imagine. Back then. They started the investigation because of the Hitler-Stalin pact. Suddenly Stalin was with Hitler, so they decided, okay, it's okay to investigate what the communists are doing in the schools. But then, of course, that became verboten. You don't even look into what they're doing. And Eubanks said a very curious thing to me. She said, it's very interesting. We have these documents of how to educate the children, but there's other documents in Russian, not translated in English, explaining why this education program has the design it does. And those were never translated into English. We don't have access to them even in Russian. They're kept secret in Moscow to this day.
We need to do a whole show on this education system thing, because I mean I have two children, right? And Germany has one of the most expensive school systems in the world, and it's we just had the new there was the results of the cross-border, comparative testing system. So this is when these different countries, they test their students and they compare the results, and we stink. Basically, we totally stink. This is Germany right now. And so yeah, there was this somebody gave me this book once. It's called the Leipzig Connection. This was about these German universities and German researchers who then collaborated with the Americans, and then these Americans came here. I think it was even Dewey or some of these people. Yeah, something like that. Something like that. They came over. To Germany, and they worked with these Germans, and then they took these results and brought them back to the States, and did all the wrong things with it. Yeah, and so this man, this influence for the technocrats, this influence guy for the technocrats, Thorstein Veblen, he published a text called "The Engineers and the Price System," and he basically called for a Soviet, meaning a council of scientists. So they would decide things and what the prices are and that sort of stuff. You can find the text online. It's called "The Engineers and the Price System." And so today's climate council, or shall we say climate Soviet, the IPCC, it's sort of kind of fulfilling the same functions. It is a council where they take the science from selected scientists, and what the IPCC then presents, for example, that is being looked at by, for example, the highest court in Germany. So then it becomes a legal thing, and so then the German German Constitutional Court, they make decisions based on these IPCC reports. And these decisions are binding for the politicians. So their framework of deciding things becomes more narrow, because that Soviet council thing, that climate thing, they can influence German lawmaking and decision making. And there's been calls by popular activists to have another Soviet, specifically in Germany, that can decide or veto all kinds of things. So this is basically kind of like what Thorstein Veblen was calling for.
Yeah, and this goes back 100 years. Robin Eubanks' book is Credentialed to Destroy. That's her book. And it is a technical book, so it's hard going, but it's worthwhile. And if you go back, there was another historian. He wrote a history of the American Revolution. His name was Smith. I'm trying to remember his first name. He wrote a fabulous book called The Death of the Spirit. And it was after, if you remember, the closing of the American mind was a big phenomenon back in the early 90s, in the 90s, in the United States, written by Professor I'm not remembering his name either, but it became famous. He actually attacked one of my senior professors in my department when I was in graduate school in the 80s. Actually, no, the book came out in the 80s because I was actually stupidly reading it in front of the professor who was sort of the villain of the book, who was David Easton, who was the longtime head of the American Political Science Association, who was a closet Marxist, right? Closet. And I didn't realize, and of course he was attacked in the closing of the American mind. But this Death of the Spirit is a history of American education going back to the 19th century. And a lot of people don't realize in the 19th century, America's colleges were Christian colleges, private Christian schools, and how they evolved into state schools, and how the socialist movement, which existed before it became Leninized, right? was starting to pervade it, and of course, it wasn't Page Smith, maybe it was Page Smith. In the book, he goes into how the character of these people, he basically describes educationists and professors in academia as a bad lot, as characterologically people of with foul natures. And he refers to personal experience. His books were very popular. He was a left of center American academic historian, but he had great literary talent. And so he noted all of his colleagues were massively hateful and envious that he was a popular lecturer and popular writer, made a good amount of money by turning his knowledge of history into good literature. And he talks about this culture of envy within academia and how toxic it was. Now, I experienced some of this when I was in academia. When I basically lost my academic career, I couldn't understand why, being out of that environment, I felt this natural elation because I didn't realize I was depressed being around these people.
Yeah.
And it was like, wow, I feel a lot healthier not being around these toxic people.
So, that guy called Mr. Veblen. Yeah. He said the following: the existing industrial capitalism, it cannot be stopped, or it cannot be destroyed through a leftist revolution. Instead, you could achieve the goal of taking over. You could achieve that goal through a movement of scientists. That was his idea. So just paint the communist movement, paint it as a technocratic movement, okay? And so most people don't remember Mr. Veblen, but when United States President Clinton visited the Norwegian king, Harald V, Clinton made a reference to about Mr. Veblen. He was praising Mr. Veblen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I just as a note, H.L. Mencken, the famous American humorist and newspaperman, an essayist, wrote a very famous essay debunking Veblen more than 100 years ago, which is very much worth reading to this day.
Yeah, and so then the next crazy chapter in this saga was this: the Canadians were because a lot of this activism by the technocrats that was going on in Canada. This organization where Elon Musk's grandfather was heavily involved in. So the Canadians, they had enough of it, and the Canadians actually banned this group. They outlawed or banned this group. And so the Canadian Royal Mounted Police arrested several members of this organization called Technocracy Incorporated. And they also arrested the former director called Joshua Norman Haldeman, who was the grandfather, or who's the grandfather of Elon Musk. And you can find the original, or a scan or a photo of the original newspaper article on the web. So this happened. Joshua Norman Haldeman was arrested.
So Elon Musk's grandfather was involved in leftist activities.
Yes, but it gets crazier than that.
Really? But by the way, Thorstein Veblen's famous book was The Theory of the Leisure Class. And that's the one that H.L. Mencken lampooned.
Okay, everybody, please brace yourselves. So the story continues. Haldeman was trying to reinvent himself as a right-winger and as a conspiracy buff, of all things.
Familiar.
Of all things. So he was a big fan, or he became a big fan of South Africa with the apartheid, because he said the apartheid was helping the white civilization, was helping the whites in the fight against the international conspiracy. And the international conspiracy was, he defined it as Jewish bankers. And so the Jewish banker conspiracy, according to him, was behind, the hordes, as he called, the hordes of colored people. So
there you have a little bit of kind of Nazi-like anti-Semitic.
Yeah. So he sort of rebranded himself as that. And so in 1950, 2 years after the beginning of apartheid in South Africa, he moved his family to Pretoria, and he became a fan of the regime. And so now the press, journalists have actually found some of the old writings that he put out, Mr. Haldeman. So one of these things is called The International Conspiracy to Erect a World Dictatorship and the Threat for South Africa. This document is from May 1960. And he also put out The International Conspiracy in the Medical Sphere, and he was agitating against vaccines. Okay. Haldeman was a leader. Haldeman was a leader of the Canadian Social Credit Party. That's a weird name, I would say. The Canadian, and people can look into this more, and I will look into this more. So Haldeman was a high-ranking member of the Canadian Social Credit Party. And this party published the Protocols of Zion. And so he believed that this was necessary because you could see the protocols in the real world. He thought you could interpret the world according to the protocols. And so this technocracy that he was involved in, they called technocracy a science of social engineering. They wanted to completely change the social mechanisms for production and distribution of goods and services. So for the first time, and I'm quoting from this nonsense, for the first time in history, everything will be solved like a scientific problem, a technical problem. There won't be any space for politics or politicians. There won't be any space for finance or financiers.
Sounds very Soviet, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely.
It sounds like a kind of mix of
and so the technocracy,
socialism and Sovietism.
And then it says the technocracy, so the future they envision, this system, the technocracy will have a system of distribution of goods, and when you are born, you will get your number in the system, and you will get your official document, so you can get the goods from the system for the rest of your life. So this is what they said. Now imagine why the Canadian government at some point, shut down this group, right? And then you got, from these technocrats, you get some of these promises, the same kind of promises which you've heard from the communists. People would have only a 4-day work week, and they would only work 4 hours per day. So 4 hours.
16 hours a day?
Yeah. No.
I mean 16 hours a week. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So it's a week. Exactly. So it's 4 days. That's it. And also there was a very similar there was a similar technocracy movement in Russia, led by Alexander Bogdanov. He eventually ran into trouble with the Bolsheviks and the Lenin type communists, because they didn't want any other movement there. But the Russians, they had some of this, something like this too. So then May, the daughter of Joshua Haldeman, married Errol Musk, and one of the sons is Elon Musk. And so Elon told the story how he really didn't like his father, and he was trying to make it on his own. He was not a trust fund kid who got his way through college paid for. Elon ended up, as he said, with $100,000 in student debt, and he was working also the whole time. So he was a very busy guy. And so now, of course, this begs the question: how much of a technocrat is Elon, and what kind of a technocrat may Elon be? Because some people, they may think, you can have a technocracy that is more, not so communist, or maybe not, but, quite a few of these technocrats, they still have Soviet or communist ideas. So is Elon a technocrat? Would he want a society where engineers make all the decisions and run everything? Because if I listen to him, if I listen to Elon when he's on the Joe Rogan podcast, when I listen or read his tweets, you can tell that Elon has been busy for so long with other things, he just didn't have the time to really read a ton of stuff on the empires and economics and all that stuff. So he's praising books like The Libertarian thing, The Road to Serfdom. He's mentioned MK Ultra, to show that he's interested in that sort of stuff. But it just sounds like me when I was 17 or something. Or it sounds like somebody else who was 20 years old and who's just reading up on libertarian ideas and covert operations and stuff. It seems very beginner-like, and so it's
sure. Well, he's been a very busy guy. That's one of the problems, is that people have to spend time to learn this stuff.
Yeah, but everybody seems to now expect him to have all the answers for politics and the Ukraine war and all of this, and he's supposed to talk about the Russians and this and that. He's just not the guy for these tasks. He's supposed to run these technological companies.
SpaceX.
Yeah, and Tesla and Starlink, that's what he can do best. He can work with engineers, and that's what he said recently. It's almost all engineering. He's fascinated with engineering, and so maybe he's influenced by this technocracy stuff, and maybe he's somebody.
I think it's good that he read The Road to Serfdom, because that at least makes him. He has shown himself to be pro-freedom. And that's big, because a lot of these people are willing to undercut freedom. But that doesn't mean he isn't going to be taken advantage of by the disinformation machine, the active measures of the Russians and the Chinese. I've heard him say positive things about China. And of course, he has business dealings with China, which is very disturbing, that he is so naive about the Chinese. Very naive.
Yeah, or maybe he thinks it's pragmatism. It's like maybe somebody told him that if we deal with China, maybe they will become normal one day, which they will not.
Never.
But I've seen him on his Chinese visits, and they treat him like royalty. They're full red carpet treatment. Because of the batteries.
That's what they do for billionaires from the West.
Yeah, because of the batteries. And it's another thing as well. I understand how, well, not fully understand, but I kind of understand how crazy it is to establish a car company. Okay? And so, of course, there were production issues for a while, and there were people who left Tesla and said bad things about the production there. And one of the points of critique was the software, because if you want to make an electric car, you actually don't need a lot of software, because you have these electric motors, you have the baseline functions that you need. So you don't really need a lot of software to run this car. But when you want this big tablet in the middle console, if you want to, have all these electronic gadgets, if you want the doors to make this dance, if you want this supercharger system and have software updates, by remote being transmitted to your car system, if you want to have all these gadgets and make this feel modern, software is a problem because software can be attacked by hackers, by insider threats. So the more people drive Teslas or other brands that have too many computers in them, the more vulnerable the system really is. I mean, if
an old car.
Yeah, people can see this all over YouTube, how you can restore vehicles from the 1950s, the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s. So sometimes these are cars that have absolutely no computers in them whatsoever. So it's it's possible to refurbish the engines and to overhaul the transmissions and just to make everything run reliably. And these cars, they can never be harmed by a hacker. They cannot be stopped by remote. They do not have any window for an attacker, an electronic attacker
and
to
really
enter the
old
system.
Ones can't be stopped by an EMP.
Yeah, because there's not even a primitive computer module in them. It's literally just wires and metal and chemicals and moving parts. And so it's just, for me, this electric car thing. It's just, for me, it's just a security nightmare. It really is a security nightmare. It's not just Tesla, it's all these other brands that have become so complicated and convoluted because now you have 20, 30 gadgets in your car. So you don't have mirrors,
and of course,
you have cameras.
All for that convenience, we sacrifice security.
Yeah.
We sacrifice the resilience of our vehicles, trucks, cars, everything we need to survive because we don't have horses anymore. Right,
and
we don't have horses pulling wagons anymore.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the wealth of the United States was built with diesel trucks, larger diesel trucks, and these mid-sized or smaller pickup trucks. It's just so silly when Germans when Germans complain about Americans driving big cars and big SUVs and big, powerful trucks. I mean, first of all, Americans have more kids than we do, so they need more seats. The country is bigger and larger. They have to move things from A to B, or they have to haul things. They're heavy. And so and you can use a pickup truck for commercial purposes and private purposes. And so it makes sense to have reasonable cars in America. And when you have a diesel car or a gasoline car, you fill it up and you have quite a bit of range, and you can organize more gasoline. Even in a crisis, you can still find more gasoline, you can still find more diesel. But if the electrical system is affected, what are you going to do with these electric cars?
There goes your limited range vehicle. You can't even get it to last you a week.
I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, sure, some people have solar systems and this and that, but I mean, if more and more people have these electrical cars and they want to fill up these batteries, I mean, how are you going to do that and just stay mobile?
And the Chinese get rich by selling the lithium for the batteries, by making the batteries.
Exactly, and they pay for their navy with that money. So I mean, if Elon, I mean, of course, Elon is not the first guy to have dealings with the Chinese. So it would be unfair. Would be unfair to totally single him out. But now he's become this figurehead for conservatives and this big hope for conservatives. but and he seems so security minded. Why? What is he thinking about? The Chinese and that problem and the hacking problem and the power grid
And he
problem.
doesn't really know. I think it is just a case of ignorance. And this is the problem with a lot of folks. I think Bill Gates got sucked into the Chinese without realizing what he was walking into. And God knows how they compromised him or how they control him or manipulate him or push him in this or that direction, like the the big foundation he had that supports all these
Yeah.
vaccinations. Um, people think there's an elite conspiracy of billionaires. No, billionaires are extremely vulnerable to the communist apparatus. They're extremely exposed.
Yeah, and I mean, uh, some people they grow up poor, Joe Rogan, and they are susceptible for communist ideas, right? And some people they don't grow up that poor, but they still have to struggle, like Elon Musk. And so some of these people, when they get rich, they are willing to give money away for left-wing purposes or other purposes, and that can become a problem. Can become a real problem, because the bigger you get, the worse your mistakes are going to affect the world. And so, yeah, I mean, Elon may have a super high IQ, but so did Albert Einstein, who was unfortunately a communist, who was really stupid when it came to politics. Or the Rosenbergs, the atomic spies, high IQ, capable engineers, but easy to fool, by the KGB or the GRU or whoever was handling them back then. So yeah, I mean, just don't look at these people as your guides when they're not specialized in these things. I mean, Elon Musk is highly specialized in running these technical companies. That's the only thing he specializes in. And Alex Jones is not specialized in the empires and intelligence operations. He's just not that kind of guy. He's
He's just a loudmouth demagogue with a love for conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, do people remember these 1980s and 1990s wrestling programs on television? The WWE wrestling.
With
In that
fake
era,
wrestling.
yeah, because
It's
in
fake,
that era,
right? It's really fake.
because obviously it's staged fighting, but what I was thinking about was when I saw Alex Jones's performance over the years, it reminded me of these old wrestling promos. Now, a promo is what the wrestling industry calls a short video. It's staged like an interview, like this. The moderator guy, something like Joe Rogan used to do, with the UFC. So this guy is interviewing the fighter about the upcoming fight. And back then in the 80s and 90s, it was commonplace to have these extreme performances. So it was super aggressive and screaming and grunting and pointing fingers and slamming tables. And this just reminded me of Alex Jones. When you watch some of these old clips online, it's basically somebody who's read a handful of John Birch Society books and is emulating old wrestling promos, with the yelling and the screaming and the grunting,
Yeah.
even those grunting sounds. I mean, this was like Hulk Hogan back in the days, or the Ultimate Warrior, back in the days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I
No,
mean,
I think you pegged it exactly right. And we've been going more than 2.5 hours now, and I think we have to end. But this has been great, Alex. We've covered a lot about how they manipulate people and how the right is moving to the left has been moving to the left, and how everything is screwed up and we're disconnected from reality, from the truth. We're all caught up in these narratives, conspiracy narratives and other narratives, and the scissors strategy. So we've touched a lot on that, and we've talked about a lot of sources. So I hope we've given, if those have taken notes on what we've said, I hope this is helpful. I'm Jeff Nyquist. I've been here with Alex Benesch. He's in Germany. I'm in the United States. And I want to thank you for joining us for this week's Friends and Enemies.